Princess Diana's brother stayed silent for years, years on end. While documentaries piled up, interviews detonated across headlines, memoirs cracked open royal walls, and endless battles turned one family tragedy into a worldwide spectacle. He watched, he listened, and until now he said almost nothing. Because according to explosive whispers swirling through royal circles, Charles Spencer has finally hit his breaking point. And if those whispers are true, the verdict he has delivered about Prince Harry is so brutal, so unexpected, and so politically explosive that even seasoned palace insiders were reportedly left staring at each other in disbelief. Think about this for a second. Out of everyone tied to Princess Diana, there is arguably no figure more emotionally shielded from criticism than Harry. For decades, he was framed as Diana's wounded son, the boy trailing behind his mother's coffin, the prince whose grief seemed frozen in suspended time, the son many believed inherited Diana's rebellious fire more than anyone else. But what happens when Diana's own brother allegedly starts seeing something very different? That is where tonight's story begins. Because this is not just another chapter in the endless Harry and Meghan saga. This is something far deeper, something far more personal. This is about ownership of Diana's legacy, who protects it, who profits from it, and who gets to decide its next chapter. For nearly 30 years, Charles Spencer has stood guard over parts of Diana's life the public has never seen. The private letters, the family memories, the personal stories, the emotional fragments of Diana that never became headlines. While everyone else debated her legacy, he quietly controlled access to the pieces that mattered most. And according to growing speculation, that role has become increasingly strained as Harry and Meghan's media empire expanded. At first, many believed Spencer fully sympathized with Harry. Why wouldn't he? Both men shared frustration toward the press. Both carried painful memories tied to Diana's death. Both publicly criticized elements of the royal establishment. The alignment seemed obvious. But then something shifted, slowly, almost invisibly, like cracks forming beneath the surface before anyone notices the ground moving. The first signs reportedly appeared as Diana's memory became increasingly intertwined with Harry and Meghan's public project. Every major documentary, every major interview, every emotional comparison, every reminder that Meghan's struggles somehow echoed Diana's experiences. Some viewers saw tribute, others saw branding, and somewhere in the middle sat Charles Spencer watching it all unfold. Because while millions saw headlines, Spencer reportedly saw something else entirely. A pattern, a familiar pattern, the kind of pattern that would make any protective brother deeply uneasy. The more Diana became central to commercial projects, the more questions reportedly began circulating inside aristocratic circles. Was her story being preserved or repackaged? Was her memory being honored or turned into an asset? Those questions grew louder after the Netflix era began. Suddenly Diana's image is everywhere once more, her interviews, suffering, struggles, clashes with institution, pain, repeated again and again on repeat again. And every time audience returned to Diana, Harry and Meghan stayed at center of story once again there. That is where rumors suggest Spencer's patience began running dangerously thin. Not because he disliked Harry, not because he backed William against his nephew, but because he allegedly feared something far larger. The transformation of Diana from person into a commercial product. And once that concern entered the picture, every new development reportedly looked different, every comparison, every emotional parallel, every attempt to position modern royal conflicts beside Diana's tragedy, what supporters called storytelling, critics increasingly called monetization. And according to palace whispers, Spencer was listening carefully. Then came what some insiders now describe as breaking point, a proposal, a conversation, a vision for future projects centered around Diana's life reportedly. The details remain heavily disputed, but one version of events keeps resurfacing from royal commentators that Spencer was presented with ideas involving deeper access to Diana's private world. Not public Diana, private Diana, the Diana nobody else controlled, the Diana protected inside family archives. And suddenly, the gatekeeper faced a decision. Open the vault or slam it shut. The answer, according to those reports, was immediate. No, not maybe. Not later. No. And what happened next reportedly stunned people on both sides of the Atlantic, because the refusal was interpreted by many observers as something far bigger than a simple rejection. It looked like a statement. That question changed everything because once royal watchers started asking it, a second and even more explosive possibility emerged. What if Charles Spencer's real concern was never choosing William over Harry at all? What if his concern was choosing Diana over everyone? Suddenly the story looked completely different. For years the public has framed every royal disagreement as a contest. William versus Harry, palace versus Montecito, tradition versus rebellion. But according to persistent speculation, Charles Spencer may have been operating from an entirely different perspective. He may not have been asking who wins. He may have been asking who benefits. And that is where the alleged verdict becomes so devastating. Because if the rumors are true, Spencer's message was not that Harry is the enemy. It was something far more painful. The message was that Diana's memory should never become anyone's business model, anyone's marketing strategy, or anyone's shortcut back into the spotlight. Think about how difficult that would be for Harry to hear. This is not a distant historian discussing Diana. This is her son, a man who has spent most of his life carrying the trauma of losing her. A man who sincerely believes he is protecting her story. A man who has repeatedly argued that many of his decisions were shaped by what happened to his mother. Now imagine being told that your efforts to protect her legacy are now seen by some as something entirely different altogether. That remains the emotional earthquake sitting beneath this entire saga. And although nobody outside the family knows what private conversations have truly taken place, one fact has become impossible to ignore. The gap between William and Harry appears wider than ever, and increasingly Diana's legacy now sits right in the middle of that divide itself here. William rarely speaks publicly about his late mother's memory still. When he does, it is usually tied to charity work, mental health initiatives, homelessness projects, or causes she supported lifetime. Harry, meanwhile, has often spoken more openly, more emotionally, and more frequently about Diana's influence publicly now. Neither approach is truly right or wrong, but both are very different. And according to growing royal speculation, Charles Spencer may have become increasingly aligned with the quieter approach. Not because it generates headlines, because it avoids them instead. That distinction matters because the alleged harsh verdict was never about a documentary interview or proposal alone. Deeper issue was what comes next. If one project gains access to private archives, what stops next? If one exception is made, where does the line get drawn afterward then? How many pieces Diana remain private? How much becomes public property? Those questions reportedly weigh heavily on the man who has spent decades protecting what remains unseen behind private closed doors. And perhaps that explains why silence finally ended. Not with a dramatic television appearance, not with a press conference, not with a public attack, but with what many observers interpreted as a firm refusal to move an inch at all times. In some ways may be the strongest statement Charles Spencer could ever make. Because silence can be ignored, boundaries cannot. The irony remains impossible to miss now. Nearly 30 years ago, Charles Spencer stood before the world promising to protect Diana's sons then. Today, according to the theories dominating royal discussion, he believes protecting Diana herself may require disappointing one of those sons. That is the tragedy at the heart of this story. No matter which side people choose, nobody really wins here. A brother protects a sister. A son protects a mother. Another son protects a memory. And somewhere between these competing forms of loyalty sits a legacy powerful enough to shake an entire monarchy decades after Diana's death, still today. Which brings us to final question. If Charles Spencer truly has ended years of silence, perhaps his verdict was never directed at Harry alone. Perhaps it was directed at everyone who still sees Diana as story to be sold rather than life to be remembered ultimately. And if that is the case, the vault may remain closed for a very long time because people inherit money, inherit titles, inherit palaces still. Spencer inherited responsibility. And according to the speculation surrounding this latest royal storm, that is one inheritance he has absolutely no intention of surrendering.